Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Paul, and I'm really happy to welcome you today. We are now streaming live to Facebook, and we have an hour for this session going on right now. I'd like to introduce you, first of all, to our speakers today, and I'd like to introduce you to Kirsten. And Kirsten Campbell-Howes is the Chief Learning Officer at Busuu. And I'm just going to hand you over to Kirsten for a brief introduction from Kirsten.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all. As Paul said, I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Busuu, where I've been for 7 years, but I've been working in language learning for 20 years. Started out as a teacher of English in China, and then quickly moved into the more sort of digital startup ed tech world. And I've been helping people to learn various different languages online ever since. I'm looking forward to talking to you about that.
Mm-hmm. And you can see, if you're not familiar with the Busuu platform, I highly recommend you check it out. You can see it on your screen right now, and it allows you to learn a language in 10 minutes a day, as you can see here. Moderating today's conversation is John Gorham, and John Gorham has his own YouTube channel, which is Education Solutions. Is that correct, John?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I'm just kind of still admitting some people here.
Thank you, John.
Into the Zoom room, but yes, it's great to be here. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us as well. And just a real brief introduction about myself. I am an assistant professor at a private university in Tokyo, Japan, and I've been involved with educational technology now for going on almost 8 years now, since I've got my master's in ed tech. So, and currently, what you're looking at here is just my my YouTube site, and it's geared towards people who are not really familiar with educational technology. So I try and help people out in order to simplify ed tech. So great. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, John. And I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. My name is Paul. I am the founder of a website called ZenGengo, which is mainly for language teachers to create activities for their students. So please check out ZenGengo if you have a chance. And I'm also the founder of Tiltal, which is the organizer of today's event. You can go to tiltal.org to find out more about Tiltal, technology in language teaching and learning. And we also have a Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/Tiltal. And this webinar is being streamed to that group right now. So you can watch it on Facebook if you prefer, or here.
To start off here, let's go ahead and take our very first topic here, and that's technology versus methodology. So is it really a dichotomy? That's what we're going to talk about first here. So I'm going to start with Kirsten, our guest here. Go ahead, please, Kirsten.
I don't think it needs to be a dichotomy at all. And I think the two go hand in hand, and the best results for people learning languages are when you use technology, good technology, with good methodology. And this is really important for us at Busuu. So although we teach digitally, our students, and we have over 120 million registered students all around the world, learning 13 or more languages with us, all the people who create the courses for Busuu are former classroom-based language teachers, and we've all been trained in various different methodologies, and we continue to learn about methodologies all the time. So when we're creating our class materials, we're not just inventing things from the air. We're thinking about what worked for us in the classroom, what's worked for us as learners of languages ourselves, what the research is telling us. And we're trying to apply that in the digital environment to make something that works for students wherever they are and whatever their circumstances are. So for me, it's not methodology or technology. It's technology and methodology working very closely together.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And Paul, how about you? Thank you, Kirsten, by the way. Paul, what do you think about this one? Tech versus methodology, technology versus methodology. So is it really a dichotomy?
I think basically I agree. It's hard to disagree with Kirsten, I think there. And I think this question came up because when I posted the event, I had the title technology versus methodology just as a stylistic thing. And then people started saying, oh, it's not a dichotomy, you know. It's that. So the verses was a bit of a coincidence. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a feedback loop. I mean, technology brings about new methodologies, right? I mean, it wouldn't be possible to have online lessons without the technology that powers those online lessons. But we also have to use technology in accordance with methodologies that we know work and have been proven to bring about significant gains in language proficiency. One of those might be communicative language teaching, which I know Kirsten's going to touch on later.
Mm-hmm.
But there's others that are more traditional kinds of methodologies, such as grammar translation method or audiolingual method, that are still widely used and I think can be effective in moderation.
Great. So do you think that there are certain methodologies that maybe particularly complement certain technologies?
I'm going to pass over to Kirsten for that first,
Okay.
I think.
Well, there are certain methodologies that are very easy to use with certain technologies. So if you've got a phone with a small screen, multiple choice exercises, true false exercises, all these sort of quite simple basic exercises are quite easy to do. And teaching vocabulary is kind of easy. So you'll often see things like the grammar translation method used. Duolingo is a good example of this using technology. You might also see elements of audiolingual where you're listening and repeating. But those are quite limited. Those are just sort of, you know, that's a way of learning and practicing your pronunciation or memorizing some vocabulary. For our learners, the majority of them tell us what they are trying to do is to speak a language. And they want to be able to do that using technology because it's really difficult for them to travel to the country of the language that they're learning and immerse themselves, for example, or it's very expensive or difficult for them to travel to a classroom, or maybe they live in a place where, you know, if they're Turkish learning Japanese, there probably aren't that many Japanese classes around them. So technology is what they turn to be able to learn to speak the language. And for me and for my team, what we tend to use is an adapted version of the communicative methodology, right? That's what I used in the classroom that I saw having the biggest, most powerful effect on people's ability to speak. And so what I've been trying to do and what my team tries to do at Busuu is to take the best elements of communicative language teaching and apply those in a digital environment.
Which methodologies complement synchronous technologies, Paul?
Okay, so synchronous technologies. So we're talking about things like Zoom that we're doing now. We're talking about things like maybe Google Meet. We're talking about other video-enabled platforms and audio-enabled platforms. So yeah, I think people need to understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. These terms have been used a lot since COVID came around, I think. You know, but they were around before that. But basically speaking, you know, synchronous technology allows you to communicate in real time with other people, and asynchronous is kind of there's a time delay from when you post the message to when the message is read. And I think both are really useful for learning languages, and there's different sites that use these different technologies. I think actually going back to Busuu, I think you recently incorporated some synchronous teaching in the platform. Is that right, Kirsten?
Yes, we did. So this is something we've introduced in the last 2 years. Prior to that, for most of its history, Busuu was asynchronous, but it did importantly have communicative practice despite being asynchronous. So we have our community. So everyone on Busuu is both a learner of a language and a speaker of a language. And part of what we ask you to do is to record your voice or share a piece of writing in response to a prompt. So we might ask you to describe your family, for example. You can share a short piece of writing or record your voice. We then send that out into the community asynchronously. Someone will take some time to read it and respond. And either a conversation will develop or someone will give you feedback on your grammar or your spelling. And in that way, we've been able to do communicative practice asynchronously. And I think that can actually get you quite far. I've seen people who've studied just with Busuu getting to a kind of A2 level of communicative competence without having a single class with a teacher, which might surprise some people. But once you get up into that kind of A2 level, you really do, I think, benefit, especially if you are not in the country of the language that you're learning, from having that practice with a professional teacher. So 2 years ago, we started to bring that into our platform. And now if you're learning English, Spanish, French, or German with us, you can have a group lesson in those languages with a professional teacher. And as I mentioned before, those are super, super focused on speaking skills. So we really don't spend much time learning new vocabulary or studying grammar rules in those lessons. It's all about developing fluency and automaticity with the language through lots of speaking practice.
So the grammar translation method, for people who are not familiar with it, is a kind of old-fashioned, well, some people think it's an old-fashioned method of basically taking the target language so the L1, your first language that you have native knowledge of, and L2, the target language, and you'll be translating between the two. Okay, so it's a very traditional method, and I think it's designed really to be done as an individual. Some people think it is more old-fashioned, but actually it still has a use in modern language teaching, I think, as well. For example, CEFR, the Central European Framework, refers to translation as a kind of a fifth skill. So you've got listening, reading, writing, speaking, and translation. So yeah, it would be a method that's not particularly collaborative. I mean, you could do it in a collaborative way. For instance, if you gave one student a target sentence and another student the L1 sentence, and see if they could match them together. There are ways that you could do it collaboratively, I think, but I think it's mainly designed to be a kind of autonomous study method.
I have actually seen it used quite well in one-to-one classes, interestingly, which sort of, I'd kind of dismissed the grammar translation method. And then I had a Spanish class recently with a teacher who split his class into two parts. And the first part was very much grammar translation. He would give me a sentence in my native language, English, and then he would ask me to translate it into Spanish. And he would do this for 5-10 minutes. And over time, it actually started to develop this automaticity with me a bit better. And then when it got a bit much, he would stop and we would just start having more natural conversation. Mm-hmm. And I was slightly surprised by this, because this kind of went against what I'd seen in language teaching, but it has made me sort of question whether it can be effective in that sort of mode of teaching. It only works in one-to-one where the teacher can also speak the student's native language. So it wouldn't work so well in our group classes where we can have a student from China, a student from Israel, a student from Germany, and a teacher from the United States, or a teacher from Poland, for example. And you can't rely on everyone sharing the same common language. But in one-to-one, I was quite surprised to see that methodology being used quite effectively.
Just before we leave grammar translation, I mean, we mentioned Duolingo before. I think it started originally as a way to translate the web. the guy who started it, Louis von Ahn, I think his name is, had this idea about games with a purpose, GWAP, games with a purpose. And his idea was, let's translate the entire web and make it into a game, so it's quite clever. And I think translation can be gamified, and Duolingo does that quite well, and other sites as well do it quite well. I think it can be done as a game, and it can be auto-graded, which is also very convenient. If you're a programmer like myself, you can actually auto-grade grammar and translation, whereas kind of conversation with another individual, it's a lot harder to assign automatic feedback to that kind of activity. Yeah.
What do you think about in regards to balance? What do you think the best balance is of a face-to-face versus online study? Kirsten, I'll turn this one over to you.
I'll take this one because we've actually done some research into this, and I have a number which is kind of interesting. So we did an efficacy study into Busuu last year, and one of the things that came out of it, it wasn't our main research question, but we followed a cohort of students who did a pre-test and a post-test. They spent 2 months studying on Busuu. They did a combination of self-study and live online classes. And the students who did best on the test, who got the best results at the end, were those who spent between 30 to 50% of their study time on live teacher-led classes, which means they were spending 50 to 70% of their time on autonomous self-study. And this kind of surprised us, because I think one of the assumptions I had at the outset was maybe it's best if you spend as much time as possible in a live class with a teacher, getting as much speaking practice as possible, right? Mm. But actually the results didn't bear that out. People who gorged on live classes tended to do worse on the tests. And my team and I thought about this, and the hypothesis that we have is that they were taking on too much new language and new structures, and they didn't have enough time to sort of play around with that language in self-study, to sort of cement those memories of new vocabulary, and to really get comfortable with that language. So the approach we recommend is that you spend, say, an hour a week on self-study, and then you have a 45-minute live lesson at the end of that, and it's all reinforcing each other. This approach of Paul Nations is one that I came across in my master's study quite some years ago. And it's something I've taken into Busuu, and the team actually uses this as a sort of analysis tool to look at our syllabus. So we try and make sure we cover all of these 4 elements. It's not 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, because that doesn't really work with our syllabus, but we do make sure we cover all of these elements. And we try to bring in a lot of this comprehensible input, which is so vital and so necessary in order to have any kind of comprehensible output, right? So we have a lot of listening and reading in our both our self-study and in our live lessons, actually, so that students are getting exposed to the same structures, the same lexis again and again and again, and it has a chance to go into the long-term memory.
Paul, do you have anything that you want to add to that about any significant difference between face-to-face lessons versus an online lesson, for example?
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting question, because we've all been forced into the situation where we have to teach online, right? For the past 2 years, every teacher, almost every teacher in the world, and many language teachers in Japan and other places like that, we had to teach online. We have no choice, right? So now we've the question of whether there's a real difference between what we're doing now, talking over Zoom, and talking face to face. That's interesting to me. I mean, in some ways we are face to face. Like I can see your guys' faces. Right? We're face to face in that respect. Sometimes there's technological problems. There might be like delay or lag. There might not be a very good microphone. There might be, network difficulties. But if you take away all those technical problems and you assume a perfect, connection, is there really a huge difference between face-to-face, as in you're in the same room physically with someone, and doing a lesson over Zoom? I'm interested what you guys think about that. I'm not really sure. Like myself, I'm still kind of thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, there is a difference. The kind of emotional, social element is somewhat missing in this environment. But I have to say, after many, many years of both teaching and learning languages online, I find the difference is collapsing for me. I learned Norwegian from a Serbian teacher who was living in Belgrade. And I spent 2 years talking to her every week on Skype, and we became really good friends. And we've never met in person. And I learned to speak Norwegian to quite a good conversational level. And I see many of our Busuu students achieving great things with their language learning in rapid time, just from this method. And I hope they are then taking that and applying it in the real world somewhere. And I'm in Madrid right now. I've been studying Spanish on Busuu. I've been talking to taxi drivers, been talking to people in restaurants, I've been talking to some of my colleagues in Spanish, and finding all this stuff I've been learning online has an application in the real world, which is tremendously exciting. So I think there is a difference, but it's still very effective. But the idea is that you then take what you've learned and you go and use it in the real world, I think.
I mean, I sometimes think, like, if what we're doing right now, this Zoom webinar, is not part of the real world, that what is it? It's like, it's part of my subconscious maybe, but I see what you're saying. I mean, yeah, it's a common distinction. Like we say, IRL, in real life, like offline, but what we do online is part of the real world in some respects. But I see what you're saying. But I mean, we can't travel so much now anyway. I mean, are people going to go back to traveling? I've heard the airlines are never going to recover fully.
I'm thinking about a student I spoke to who's an elderly gentleman in Switzerland who spent some of his youth in Russia and loves Russian literature, Russian culture, Russian people. And he spends a lot of time on Busuu helping Russians with their German or with their English. And he does this because he wants to maintain contact with that culture and with those people. But he's never going to travel back to Russia now. So this is his way of having real interactions with Russians, which I think is really good. And that is a real world interaction. You talked about games earlier, Paul. Busuu in the past was a lot more gamified than it is now. And we surveyed our learners and we discovered that there were these distinct groups of people, 3 groups, in fact, people who loved the gamification. It was why they were there. It was highly motivational for them. People who didn't care about it or notice it, and people who detested it and thought it cheapened the learning and wanted to avoid it. And so we ended up refining the product so that it's there if you want it, but it's not in your face and it's not compulsory, if you see what I mean.
Tying that back into methodology, that sounds a little bit behavioristic. I mean, having this kind of stimulus and reward kind of structure that a lot of games are based around, or badges, or leaderboards and that kind of thing. So are you saying that it kind of alienates a large percentage of users, that kind of thing?
Some people it alienates. I wouldn't say a large group. A lot of people love it. I mean, you can see this, right? Duolingo is very successful. It's highly gamified. A lot of our students are looking for something different. They're looking for something more pedagogic, maybe a bit more structured. But there are certain elements of human psychology that just respond well to getting points or collecting things or receiving a badge. These just tickle our brains. We call them delighters. And I think any teacher or any program of study that doesn't engage with sort of behavioral psychology and think about these things, it's the same as a teacher saying, good job, well done, guys. It makes you feel good. And so we do try and bring elements of that into the design as well, without going too sort of behaviorist about it.
Mm-hmm.
Going on approaches here, like different kind of approaches. We got the structural approach, total physical response, many different ways that we can look at things here. Kirsten, what do you think is, or rather, what is Busuu's ideal approach to language learning here?
I mean, I always talk about using and adapting the communicative methodology. That's the one I come back to again and again and again. You mentioned total physical response. I think I've only used this once when I was teaching kids, and only for an element of the class, right? There's a limit to how much you can say to people, jump up and down. At some point you've got to say, now tell me about the plot of your favorite movie, and let's use the past tense, shall we? And I don't know how you use TPR to do that.
That'd be difficult.
But I do come back to the communicative methodology again and again and again. And if a student is struggling, well, can you elicit an answer from them? If they're in an autonomous environment where there is no teacher, can you predict the kind of problems they're likely to have and present solutions to them, or present them with exercises that mean they're likely to make a mistake actually, but then learn from it? So the communicative methodology is 100% the one that I come back to.
I will mention something about TPR. I knew a guy a while back, James York actually is his name, and he had this language learning community based around Minecraft. And TPR kind of takes on a whole new life within a virtual world. You can tell users, go to the mountain and bring back a lump of coal, and they couldn't obviously do it in real life, but you can do anything like that in a game, like Minecraft or a Second Life. So yeah, it's interesting to know, because obviously Mark Zuckerberg is now pushing the metaverse, and whether we're all going to be learning languages wearing Oculus Rifts or whatever the latest hardware is called. Kirsten, do you think it's all kind of it's all castles in the sky, and it's all kind of like complete fantasy, the metaverse and learning languages in virtual reality, or is that something that could happen?
Well, we actually designed a Spanish course that you could do in Oculus, and you had to visit a hacienda in Mexico and help a Mexican wrestler choose an outfit, and you had to help someone make guacamole, and it was fabulous. It's a really great experience. But again, it's the balancing what's actually feasible with this mode, right? Because being in VR for long periods of time is challenging for humans. You can't, and you need hundreds and hundreds of hours to become fluent in a language. You're not going to do all of those hundreds of hours in VR. So I think VR has a place in language learning, but I think it's about that experiential element, like taking a group of school kids who are learning Japanese, and suddenly they put on the headset and they're in Tokyo, and they're hearing Japanese around them, they feel like they're there. And that is an intense experience of being a language speaker in the environment where that language is spoken. And I think that could be extremely motivating and a useful part of a program of study that reminds you why you're doing it. But will the majority of your language learning take place in the metaverse? I would put money on it being no. in my team at the moment, we're having a debate about, can we bring more elements of task-based learning into our group lessons? It's challenging because they're 45 minutes long, and the common thread is the syllabus. So the teacher might change and the group of students might change in each class, and it's the syllabus that unites the experience for the student. But doing any kind of extended task within 45 minutes is quite challenging. We can do kind of micro tasks where learners might go into a breakout room temporarily, for example. But yeah, I'm still trying to work out how to bring elements of task-based learning into a program of study, and when is the best time, because I think maybe at the lower levels you have slightly different needs, and actually doing a task is just the organization of it is quite complex. But I think once you get up into the C levels, potentially there's something there that could be quite motivational and quite effective. Not sure about task-based learning in VR, because then you need to have more like a kind of multiplayer game environment, which I think could be a really cool thing to build, actually. Now you're making me want to build new products, which yeah. Paul, what do you think?
For people who don't, maybe not that familiar with task-based language learning, I wonder if we can come up with a kind of a definition, a working definition. I mean, for me, it means basically having to complete a task, but the task has a very specific meaning in TBLT. So they have to use the target language to complete the task. The task might be something like build a bridge using chopsticks or something like that, or a physical thing, or maybe like a conceptual thing like plan a press release, or create an advert for a company, those kinds of things. Are we on the same kind of page with that definition?
Yeah.
Well, and also I think it's tied in directly with CLIL as well. So content and language integrated learning with a lot of task-based language learning right there. So like you said, Paul, building something, or it doesn't have to be something physical even. It could be, I guess this is coming back to more like problem-based language learning. But if you present your students with a particular problem and it's got to be done in a specific language, yeah, I actually wanted to bring up the idea of community language learning. And that was one of the biggest things, almost one of the biggest problems that I saw when everyone first went online at the beginning of the pandemic, and trying to build a community with your students. I found that once I got to that point of being able to have my students feel free to speak up, and they felt like they were interacting with people as if we were in the classroom. That was the biggest thing to overcome as far as learning on online learning is concerned. But Kirsten, if you could touch on that, like community language learning, how exactly do you think that fits in with Busuu?
Well, I mean, this has been the core, the USP, the unique selling proposition of Busuu for as long as Busuu has been around. So the founders of Busuu initially designed it because they saw things like Facebook appearing, and they thought, this is what's missing from language learning, right? Language learning is about communicating with people. Why can't we make it more like a social network? And so this is the real strength of Busuu. You can connect with other people in the community, and you can connect to different degrees, right? We literally have had people who've met and got married in the Busuu community. That's very rare, but it has happened. But we also have people who just send some writing or some speech out into the community and get feedback, and that's all they do. So it's very sort of transactional teacher relationship. Then we have other elements where, you know, people start a conversation about a topic, or they disagree about American versus British English, and it becomes almost like an argument, but it's very engaging. And then the learner is exposed to all of this additional language and cultural input as well. We haven't really talked about culture, but the cultural input can be hard to get as a distance language learner who's maybe not in the country of the language you're learning. And the community can be a way of transmitting this cultural information as well as just making you feel like you're part of something, which if you learn entirely on your own can be missing. And for some people, that's fine. They are very autonomous and they're happy to do that on their own. But for a lot of people, that social element is the glue that keeps you motivated for the long period of time it can take to become fluent in a language. So community is vital. And the great thing about digital technologies is that they actually make community easier in many ways than the real world does, right? I mean, if you've ever moved to a new place and looked around you and thought, oh, I want to meet people, but I can't just go up and say hello. In many ways, that's actually easier online. So I think digital is very powerful for community. I mean, for me, that immediately brings up chatbots, which were sort of super popular 2-3 years ago, and we saw a number of different digital language learning providers experimenting with them. We actually built one ourselves on the Facebook platform, I think, and they're cool, but they require branching narrative, and language is so complex that once you get out of very simple hello, how are you kind of interactions, very quickly the range of things you could say in response to any prompt is so huge that creating a chat bot that could actually respond to natural speech is incredibly difficult.
I think this is probably coming next, because we've just had this breakthrough with OpenAI and GPT-3. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Kirsten, but it's like the
our
biggest...
data scientists love talking about this. Yes, yeah.
it's like the biggest AI breakthrough since, I don't know, Google Translate or something, I've been experimenting with it, and it can produce some very, very realistic kind of conversations.
I've seen some scary essays that you can't believe that they were written by a machine. Yeah.
It basically like absorbed all of the text on the internet and then used that as a model of the kind of things that people would say in a given situation. So it can predict the most likely combinations of words and the most likely responses to certain questions, all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think what we need is more data of interactions with non-native speakers of languages, right? Because so far, all of this technology is being built on native speaker to native speaker interactions, and mostly in English as well. Whereas the kind of thing that a learner of English would say or do is not being modeled by the data. And that's one of the reasons why we're not able to create this hidden teacher. But with a large enough data set, maybe we could do that. But we'd need to build that data set, first of all, and make it available. Are you real? You're not a bot.
I mean, it's the Turing test, right? If you can fool someone into thinking you're real, then does it really matter? It's like if you're real enough, to achieve whatever goal is wanting to be achieved, So there are things in the uncanny valley as well. Like there's AI kind of avatars now that can be trained to say things and do things, and there's deep fakes that are basically indistinguishable from human beings. And it is in the uncanny valley. Like we'll watch it and we'll go, hang on a second, is that real human? And speech synthesis has been used for a long time. On ZenGengo, we use speech synthesis to provide listening practice, and I think it's very good for students, and it's a very efficient way to convert text to speech, for example. But there are advantages to doing it with human beings, of course, still. But the technology is catching up to the point where you can't tell the difference, I think, so, but ethically, the student should know whether they're interacting with a human being or a robot, or whether they're listening to real human speech or synthesized human speech, for example. So yeah, so Kirsten was joining us today from Busuu, which is this platform here for learning a language in 10 minutes per day. And John was joining us from Education Solutions YouTube channel. Please be sure to check that out, John Gorham Education Solutions on YouTube. And I'm the founder of ZenGengo, which is a website for developing your own language activities as a teacher. So if you want to learn a language, you can go to Busuu. If you want to teach a language, you can go to ZenGengo. And if you want to find out about how to use educational technology in your lessons, check out Education Solutions. Okay.